Hi, folks. This is Empowering Democracy, and it's one of a series called Changes Following a Likely Russian Victory in Ukraine. This is part 25, of the series. And what we're specifically concerned about here is since the war has been going so badly for the collective West, in Ukraine for quite some time now. Uh, Probably as early as 8 or 9 months ago, the United States started shifting its focus away from Ukraine. It had started out with the intention, the larger foreign policy framework of all this. The plan was for the United States to provoke Russia into a war. The United States had been planning, along with the Ukrainians, for some time to use a war, in Ukraine as kind of a battering ram to weaken the Russians and the Putin regime, specifically. The point was to try to drive the regime out and to get someone as the president of Russia who was more in sympathy with Western views and Western plans, which included the kind of looting of Russian raw materials that occurred under Boris Yeltsin. And what was also in the plans of the U.S. was to try to destroy the Russian Federation, to have the Russian Federation choose to disband into multiple states, so Russia would be so weakened that it could never rise again as a great power. That was the vision of the United States. They also looked at things from the broad geopolitical point of view. The Russians and China had come together in what appeared to be a close alliance. It was the goal of the U.S. plan to break up this alliance, by weakening Russia to such a great extent that this would also weaken China, because they could no longer rely on Russia, as an ally in case things got heavy with the United States. So essentially, from the U.S. point of view, they were taking Russia on first in order to knock off Russia, in order to weaken China, because it would no longer be part of a strong coalition with Russia. At which point, the United States intended to turn towards China and take on China. And then if that was successful, of course, the U.S. thought it could end the trend towards multi-polarity, in the world, and remain as the hegemon, the one exceptional nation, that in itself was determining the future of the world. That was the vision, of the neocons. That was their vision of the great chessboard. They called it, the geopolitical chessboard. But as long, as 8 months ago, perhaps, it was clear. It was clear to most people even before that, but it was clear even to the neocons that most likely the Russians were going to win. Now, of course, they planned on the counteroffensive, and the counteroffensive that has been taking place right now was the last throw, okay, of the dice for them. Okay, it was a desperate part, okay, of their plan, their last gasp. But even before the last gasp, okay, the collective West, specifically the United States, was turning, with the help of its allies in Asia, towards China to begin to directly take on, okay, China. So the anticipation of the Russian victory, okay, in Ukraine was causing the United States to shift its focus earlier than it planned, okay, to China, and to begin taking on China far earlier, okay, than planned. And so, what we have for you tonight, okay, is a discussion of what's been happening in terms of the shift, okay, towards China. And I want to look at this through the lens of a few articles that have appeared in the recent days. Let me first, though, make sure that I've shared this on Facebook. Okay, with that done, I'll move to a newspaper editorial from a source we do not commonly go to. This is an editorial from the Morning Star online from the UK. And the title of the editorial is BRICS expansion is positive, but not a coherent challenge to U.S. power. This is an interesting piece on the 15th BRICS summit, okay, and its implications. There's a picture of main figures of BRICS, the five who just have attempted to expand BRICS by 6 nations. There, okay, is Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, the Brazilian president, China's president Xi Jinping, South Africa's president Cyril Ramaphosa, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov pose for a BRICS group's photo during the 2023 BRICS Summit at the Santon Convention Center in Johannesburg, South Africa, Wednesday, August the 23rd, 2023. And let's go through the article. As significant as the fact of BRICS expansion are, which countries are now set to join: Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, and Jordan. Ethiopia, and Argentina. And I have to say about the Argentinian possibility that it's most probable that Argentina is not going to accept the invitation from the BRICS. If the coming election, in Argentina, but turns out, in such a way that the Peronista Party, but does not win. There are two other candidates that are ahead in the polls right now, and they have indicated they do not intend, to join BRICS. So we have to see what the results of the election will be before we can say definitely whether or not the expansion of BRICS is a 6-nation expansion or a 5-nation expansion. Going on, the 6 applicants will mean the BRICS, which already account for a larger share of world GDP than the G7 group of developed capitalist countries, rise to representing 37% of the global economy and 46% of the human race. They're also heavily concentrated in the Middle East, a region traditionally dominated by U.S. imperialism. There's a definite move from Middle Eastern powers away from Washington's orbit, and the implications for continued U.S. hegemony could be great. Could be. Socialists should be alert both to the positive aspects of BRICS expansion and to the many contradictions within the group, some already being exploited by Western imperialist powers. BRICS expansion indicates the rise of the global South. BRICS countries share an entirely accurate perception that more global institutions, especially financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, are instruments used by the United States and the old imperialist powers to maintain economic dominance through control of other countries' resources. That, of course, is a very fair summary of how the global South perceives the situation and how the Middle Eastern countries perceive the situation. And I believe that perception has also spread to the African countries. We have to note that the series of coups in West Africa, in the Sahel region, of Africa, seem to indicate that the West Africans right now are not very afraid of French intervention any longer because of the perceived weakened condition of the collective West. There is such a perception now in the shadow of the coming victory of Russia, in the Ukraine war. I am being joined by Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
Oh, thank you, Dee. I'm so happy to have you here. Dee has just completed the 8 o'clock show, of Around the World with Dee and Friends, which was hilarious in many ways. Basically, a report on the hijinks, okay, of the Israeli extremist right wing in terms of their planning of a red heifer sacrifice as the first step uh, towards cleansing, okay, the Al-Aqsa area so that a third Jewish temple can actually be built there. Okay, the article was good for many, many laughs, and I urge you to go back and watch the video of this. It is, I think, really prima facie evidence of how crazy and how dangerous these extremists inside of Israel are. But
And they're so dangerous that there's going to be a war. This is war, when you look at it, what their plan is when it
yes,
comes to the Alaska Moss.
yes, it will precipitate, okay, an Islamic war. Okay, and these kinds of hijinks, okay, I think, but also place the grand deal that the United States is trying to make between the Arabs and the Israelis. Uh, okay, it really underlines how difficult it will be to make that kind of deal because
Mhm.
it's hard to see that the Saudis are going to make any deal with a nation that is planning a red heifer sacrifice uh, in order to tear down the Al Aqsa Mosque and build a third Jewish temple on the site. I somehow, I don't think the Saudis want any part of that.
No, they don't. So as much as Joe Biden wants a deal, it's a no-go. It's a no-go.
Yes, I don't think it's a go at all. And especially not because of the increasingly perceived weakness of the United States from a military point of view that is underlined by the continued lack of progress of the collective West in Ukraine.
Mhm.
What's going on in that war simply underlines that the West is not the military power it once was, and that it suggests to people in South America, people okay, in Africa, and certainly people okay, in the Middle East okay, in general, that there may be a lot of room these days for defiance of the United States. And of course, one measure of that particular defiance is what went on, okay, at BRICS. And so we get back to the article on BRICS from the Morning Star, which is a UK publication. So let me get back to that and where I was. BRICS expansion, uh, I should underline what I previously said. Socialists should be alert both to the positive aspects of BRICS expansion and to the many contradictions within the group, some already being exploited by Western imperialist powers. So that suggests that there's pushback by the United States already to the BRICS efforts and the BRICS expansion, okay, in particular. But I'll continue now with that article. BRICS expansion indicates the rise of the global south. BRICS countries share an entirely accurate perception that most global institutions, especially financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, are instruments used by the United States and the old imperialist powers to maintain economic dominance through control of other countries' resources. So, changing economic interests provide opportunities to resolve long-standing feuds. China's brokering of a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia may, we do not know, have been facilitated by promising BRICS membership for both. And that was likely facilitated. And by the way, the entrance of Iran, and Saudi into BRICS also suggests that Saudi, especially, has been looking for a new future, which is not so close to the United States, looking for an alternative to the United States in many ways, and seeing BRICS as the alternative. Why would they see this? Well, BRICS is building new institutions, specifically the new Global Development Bank has been founded by BRICS and is there. It was founded with $100 billion, which, by the way, is greater than either the capital that was given at the start to either the IMF or the World Bank. And I'm sure there's a lot more where that came from if more capital is needed by the new development bank, because China's holding all those dollars, which could be used to capitalize the BRICS Bank, of course. But to go on. Its immediate consequence, that's the consequence of the rapprochement, of Iran and Saudi. Its immediate consequence was progress towards a peace in Yemen between the Saudi-led coalition and the Iran-backed Houthi movement. An end to Saudi Arabian rivalry weakens the United States in the Middle East. And it is no surprise that Western powers have not welcomed a prospective end to the Yemen war. Britain, and remember, this is a UK publication, Britain, so dedicated to Saudi victory, it maintained arms sales even when the US paused them over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and which has provided extensive logistical support for an air force bombing hospitals, schools, and residential areas, is reportedly deploying extra troops to oil-rich eastern Yemen, while Mohammed al-Atifi, defense minister in the Houthis' government of national salvation, said this month that the U.S. and Britain were leaving, quote, leaving no stone unturned to obstruct, unquote, any peace deal. Iran and Saudi Arabia joining the BRICS makes the success of these spoiler schemes less likely, but not impossible, says the British publication. Existing BRICS members are regularly at loggerheads. India, a core member in the seemingly anti-U.S. Hegemony BRICS, is simultaneously a member of the Quad, a U.S.-led anti-China military bloc, which, by the way, brings up another alternative for India. Yes, they're a member of this anti-China military bloc, but might they also become a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Through the BRICS, there is a rapprochement going on between India and China. We can't ignore that. If this leads to an invitation for India to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, then there might be some difficulties in India remaining simultaneously a member of the Quad. Anyway, that's something to look forward to, perhaps. BRICS expansion shows the decline of U.S. power. Its efforts to isolate Russia following the invasion of Ukraine have only worked on its closest allies. Most of the world isn't listening. Not only are they not listening, they're increasing their trade with Russia all the time. Oh, and by the way, I don't want to fail to mention the de-dollarization aspect of this. The various countries and the various continents of the world realize the U.S. institutions have been a means of keeping them in subjugation to people who want to loot the essentially the mineral wealth, of the rest of the world. And so all of these powers, all of these nations that are part of the BRICS, are interested in the de-dollarization aspect and in settling trade in currencies other than the US dollar. So, right now, something like 58% of the world's trade is settled, in dollars. So it still is often viewed as the reserve currency of the world for trading purposes. But of course, the BRICS trade is likely to be done increasingly in the local currencies of the various powers doing the trading. That's one of the aspects of what the BRICS intends to do. So that de-dollarization process is going to further weaken the influence and power of the collective West and the United States in particular. It's going to weaken the power of the Eurozone because there'll be fewer trades in euros. But of course, it's going to greatly weaken the economic influence of the United States because we may be looking at a decline of the dollar from 58% to something like 40% or even 35%, or even less. That process may happen faster than anyone anticipates. We have to wait and see. But Russia is already trading with India in rupees. There's been some difficulty there because I think Russia is running out of its capacity for rupees. But maybe the Indians can trade with the Chinese in the renminbi currency. And maybe then they can buy oil from the Russians, using the renminbi. I don't know. I'm just suggesting possibilities here. But it does not indicate any coherent foreign policy on the part of the BRICS themselves. Well, the BRICS nations are an economic alliance, and it seems like the coherence of their foreign policy is there if you look at their foreign policy as intending to create a new lending institution, and also to de-dollarize. If you look at those two goals as the primary goals, then it seems to me the BRICS nations do look fairly coherent to that extent. But to finish the sentence, but it does not indicate any coherent foreign policy on the part of the BRICS themselves, unlike the ideologically aligned G7. And the U.S.'s military and economic dominance over its European and East Asian allies has, if anything, increased since the Ukraine war started, with NATO expanding and Japan both rearming and in U.S. brokered engagement with South Korea. Well, I'm not sure I would say the military and economic dominance is expanding in the face of the coming defeat with respect to Ukraine. In other words, these increases in influence may be very temporary because defeat in Ukraine may lead to the elimination of NATO. It really depends on the Russians. If the war is settled in such a way that Russia does not look like a threat, to Europe, but only a nation that is interested in trade and also defending itself, it may be very hard for the United States to hold the core of NATO together. And that is a very, very big deal. Next sentence. The BRICS ideological diversity is a strength, and a weakness. Well, to accomplish its main goals, it perhaps can be done even though there is a considerable degree of ideological diversity. Going on, it allows any country looking to challenge a, quote, rules-based international order, unquote, in which the U.S. makes and breaks the rules to see advantages in membership. This shared interest can unite old enemies and bring together progressive governments with some of the world's most reactionary ones. But it does not systematically oppose imperialism, as India's military alliance with the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific, or that of Brazil and Latin America under former President Jair Bolsonaro, shows. And as we see in Yemen, imperialism will, quote, leave no stone unturned to divide and rule. All right. It's true, it does not yet systematically oppose, imperialism, but who knows what will come out of the addition of 5 or 6 new nations, all of whom have reason to oppose imperialism. That may lead to the ideological coherence that the Morning Star, is looking for. The rise of the BRICS is not enough to displace the U.S. or avert a third world war. Oh, well, that is true. I'd suggest the rise of the BRICS and the relative success of the BRICS thus far has made it even more clear to the United States that China is a threat but to the hegemony, of the U.S. I would even say that because of China and the development of BRICS thus far, and such activities as the Belt and Road Initiative, that it's doubtful whether U.S. Whether the hegemony of the U.S. Still exists, at all. It seems to me that a multipolar world has emerged, that BRICS shows that, in spades. If you look at both BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that makes it even more clear that we are in, a multipolar world in terms of the realities, of power. I think it makes it clear that the reactionary attempts, of the U.S. to bring the world back to a unipolar world where the U.S., is the hegemon, is something that is very unlikely to take place. So, the anti-imperialists in remaining U.S. allies like Britain must do what we can to halt the drive towards towards militarization and end our government's subordination to Washington. So that is the moral, of this particular story. It shows that BRICS is important. It shows that BRICS, is a tool for support, of the multipolar world. But it shows that there are also cracks in the move towards a multipolar world. Let's go on to the next piece and see what other conclusions we can draw about this. But first, Dee, would you like to say anything about that first piece at this point?
Okay, I was just moving dogs around here. What was I gonna say? I really don't have much to say, you know.
Okay, I'll move on to the second piece then. And that piece is from Truth Out. And the title is The U.S. is Fanning the Flames of War with China. And this is about the movement of the focus from Ukraine to China, which started some months ago, actually. The subtitle of this is U.S. Actions Intensify the Danger of Nuclear War in the Asia Pacific. This is written by one of the leading writers of Truth Out, specifically Marjorie Cohn. It was done on August 31st, 2023. Now, with respect to Marjorie Cohn, she normally writes as a legal scholar, a considerable, extremely competent scholar in that field. This is the first piece I've seen of hers that deals with foreign policy. So that's, probably simply my unawareness of what she's done, but I still think it's interesting to mention that. So this is a picture of the USS Nimitz conducting routine operations while transiting the South China Sea on February 4th, 2023. This is part of the series Human Rights and Global Wrongs. So Marjorie Cohn starts with the United States is gunning for war with China. By cozying up to Taiwan and arming it to the teeth, President Joe Biden is undermining the, quote, one China policy, unquote, which has been the cornerstone of U.S.-China relations since 1979. The Biden administration is enlisting South Korea and Japan to encircle China. I suppose here I should mention that China is responding by getting together with North Korea and with Russia, in the Far East to oppose the encirclement of China. I think that's important to mention. If the Ukraine war, is settled fairly soon, and a peace agreement should come about there, it is quite likely that Russia will turn to Siberia in order to support its end of the conflict between China, and
So I'm gonna try. I'm on the computer right now. I gotta try to bring everything in there.
sorry, Dee. Okay, going on. The U.S. military is conducting uh, provocative uh, provocative military maneuvers that exacerbate the conflict in the South China Sea. Biden is escalating tensions with China and intensifying the danger of nuclear war in the Asia Pacific. And Republican presidential candidates are also fanning the flames of war with China. Well, rhetorically, anyway. In March, a U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, okay, by the way, Avril's first name is the French for the month of April. Her parents decided to be fancy and to call her um, um, uh, Avril, pronounced in English as Avril. Haines called China the quote leading and most consequential threat to U.S. national security. Chinese President Xi Jinping stated, quote, Western countries led by the U.S. have implemented all-around containment, encirclement, and suppression against us. The Biden administration has, quote, doubled down on the most insanely bellicose aspects of Trump administration policies, especially over Taiwan, which the U.S. has long recognized as part of China, unquote. Peter Kusnik, professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, said to Truth Out. Yeah, Peter Kusnik is certainly right, uh, but this brings up a very, very big question, which is if the foreign policy of a new Trump administration would not be any different from the foreign policy of a new Biden administration, in that both would be seeking war with China, which could result in a nuclear war, then from the standpoint of the voter, why should voters who don't want a nuclear war vote for either Trump or Biden? If there's supposed to be a difference between Biden and Trump, what is the difference in this very essential foreign policy position that we are now pursuing? This position, fanning the flames of war with China, opens the United States up to the risk of nuclear war and is doing so now. We now are facing the risk of nuclear war in two theaters. Okay, the Ukraine theater and the Asia Pacific theater, because of the reckless foreign policy of this administration. Now, Trump says he would end the Ukraine war overnight and remove that risk. But that may not be a reason to vote for him in the election of 2024, because the Ukraine war might be over by the end of this year. And there evidently is no difference in policy between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, or there evidently wouldn't be any difference in foreign policy. Both would keep us risking a devastating nuclear war with another superpower. I'm not even talking about the economic disruption that would come from a war with China. That's a very serious issue, but it's a completely separate issue. The most serious issue is the risk, of nuclear war. The Biden administration has been playing with fire on two fronts. Since the war will be over, courtesy of the Russians, before the election of 2024, there is no material foreign policy difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration.
Well, they have the think tanks that are spreading all the propaganda.
They do have the think tanks, but the important thing to notice is that they're on foreign policy grounds, there are reasons to vote for neither major party candidate. They both are equally reckless
Yes, they are
when
extremely
it comes
reckless.
to foreign policy. I'm going on with the article now. More than 90% of the most advanced microchips in the world are manufactured in Taiwan. The chips are used to power our smartphones, to train artificial intelligence systems, and guide our missiles. The Trump administration imposed heavy tariffs on China imports to cut off China's access to the software, technology, and equipment they require to build the advanced chips. And today, I have to add, a new development. It's been announced that the Huawei company has introduced, a new phone whose features are superior to the most advanced of the Western companies, in their phones, and they have nanometer chip in order to create this phone. That chip, in spite of the sanctions on China, was designed in China and was manufactured by the Chinese. The existence of that chip and its use in a new smartphone suggests that the imposed heavy tariffs on Chinese imports and the sanctions that have been placed on China to cut off their access to software technology and equipment is proving to be a failure. Instead of cutting off the Chinese from access to the software technology, and equipment, we seem to have just given them an incentive to develop that software technology and equipment themselves so they could build the advanced chips. Ironic, isn't it? Another failure of U.S. policy. That Huawei phone represents a new failure of U.S. foreign economic policy. Going forward, Biden has maintained and dramatically expanded Trump's coercive economic measures and imposed a blockade on advanced semiconductors. Quote, official U.S. policy is to make a nation of almost 1.5 billion people poorer, David Brooks wrote, in the New York Times. In 1979, the United States declared the government of People's Republic of China, PRC, was, quote, the sole legal government of China, unquote. That policy was consistent with UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, which recognized the PRC as the only legitimate government of China and one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. But, quote, but now the one China policy, quote unquote, seems a relic of a far-gone era. I think they should have said a bygone era. And the U.S. seems hell-bent on militarizing the Pacific in order to contain China, unquote. Kuznick, who was co-author with Oliver Stone of the New York Times best-selling book and documentary film series, The Untold History of the United States, said, quote, "This reckless policy will, if we are lucky, lead to a new Cold War. If we are unlucky, it portends a third world war, one that our species might not survive," unquote. I'll go on record as saying one that our species will not survive, because that third world war will so pollute everything and exacerbate the climate crisis that we won't be able to keep the climate emergency within bounds and save our species before we suffer the heat death caused by global warming. Biden has repeatedly stated that the United States would use military force to defend Taiwan if it is attacked by China. The Biden administration has provided Taiwan with $619 million worth of high-tech arms. I have to say a couple of things here. Number one, all of the military simulations that I have read or heard about done by the United States, all of those say that if the U.S. attempts to defend Taiwan, if it is attacked by China, that we would lose that war, that we cannot command the Taiwan Straits at all. Long before our ships could get there, those ships would be destroyed by Chinese missiles, and fighter jets. We couldn't even get sufficiently close for our carriers to launch our fighter jets before we would be sunk by Chinese missiles. And if by that time the Chinese seek the support of the Russians, we all know the Russians have hypersonic missiles, and they will give those to the Chinese, and we have no defense at all against those hypersonic missiles. There's no known defense against them, and they can be used to destroy those carriers. They don't even need to use their nuclear arms to destroy those carriers. Those carriers would just be gone. The only military advantage we have over them in that war is the Polaris submarine force. But that is unlikely to be enough to turn the tide, unless we resort to nuclear weapons from those subs. But if we do, of course, the Chinese and Russians are only going to retaliate. And as I've already said, we don't have hypersonic missiles or defenses against the hypersonic missiles that they have. This administration has to recognize that we are not sufficiently militarily capable to defend Taiwan and make it stick. Then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August 2022, angering China, which staged extensive war games around Taiwan in response. Incidentally, those war games show that China can take over Taiwan and block off the Straits of Taiwan, totally control those straits. with no possible response from Taiwan to stop that. In April, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen met with a bipartisan U.S. congressional delegation in Simi Valley, California, the most high-profile meeting because the U.S. and Taiwanese leaders on U.S. soil since 1979. The Chinese embassy called the encounter a, quote, serious mistake, unquote. The foreign ministry responded by pledging to, quote, take resolute and forceful measures, unquote, to defend its territorial integrity. We must never forget that from the standpoint of international law, Taiwan is part of China. Arming Taiwan to defend itself against the Chinese is like the Chinese arming Texas to defend itself against the United States. I mean, this is all so ridiculous. As the G20 summit in Indonesia in November 2022, Xi told Biden in no uncertain terms, quote, the Taiwan question is at the very core of China's core interests, the bedrock of the political foundation of China-U.S. relations, and the first red line that must not be crossed. Speaking of red lines, unquote, the United States has so far crossed every red line that Russia drew for the United States before the war in Ukraine. The final red line which the United States crossed was the red line to try to include the government of Ukraine, okay, into NATO and the arming, okay, of Ukraine so that it felt comfortable planning, okay, an invasion of the Donbass. And we in the Ukraine crossed that particular red line. And what we got from Russia, who had warned us copiously about this, the response we got from Russia was the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. It would be madness, and it is madness, for Biden to cross the red line that she has drawn in no uncertain terms. The U.S. is the most war-making country in the world. Speaking on a panel as the veterans at the Veterans for Peace, the VFP annual convention on August 25th, Kuznick remarked that China has not been at war with any country since 1979. By contrast, the United States has had only 16 years of peace in its 247 years. Quote, the U.S. is the most war-making country, unquote, in the world, Kuznick said. K.G. No, an active scholar who writes about the geopolitics of the Asian continent, also spoke on the VFP panel. No described South Korea as key to the U.S.'s escalating war on China. Quote, the United States has operational control over South Korean troops, unquote, No said. The U.S. is also, quote, weaponizing Taiwan into an imperial outpost for war, unquote. Third panelist was Simone Chun, a researcher and activist specializing in inter-Korean relations and U.S. foreign policy on the Korean Peninsula. She echoed No's comments, calling South Korea a, quote, pawn in Washington's march to war against China, unquote. South Korea, Chun said, is a, quote, subcontractor in the new Cold War, unquote. In an article for Truth Out in March, Chun characterized, quote, The U.S. military encirclement of China, unquote, is threatening to, quote, to escalate into an Asia-Pacific war, with the Korean Peninsula at the focal point of this dangerous path. South Korea has 30,000 combat-ready U.S. troops on 73 U.S. military bases in the small country. Folks, what are 30,000 combat-ready U.S. troops on 73 U.S. military bases in South Korea going to do, against the millions of Chinese troops that are available for throwing into this war? This force is the pimple on the proverbial cow's butt. This is totally insignificant to the Chinese. Not to mention the fact that if North Korea takes the opportunity to invade South Korea, it will undoubtedly throw hundreds of thousands of combat-ready troops into South Korea. Since the Obama administration's, quote, pivot to Asia in 2012, 60% of U.S. naval forces have been transferred to the Asia Pacific, and 400 of the 800 U.S. military bases worldwide and 130,000 troops are now circling China, Chun wrote. I have to say, 130,000 troops circling China is nothing. The U.S.'s goal is to force China's hand by triggering and escalating a hybrid war on multiple fronts, including military, technology, economy, information, and media. And the U.S. hopes that the hybrid war is going to defeat China. Given the BRICS, the existence of BRICS, and the trading relationships there, given the technology gains of China and Russia, over a period of time, and given the fact that China can be in possession of the technology capability of Taiwan within a month, it just underscores the silliness of this whole operation, the failure to comprehend the realities of the new world, of the new multipolar world. South Korea and Japan are encircling China from the north, and Australia and Indonesia are surrounding China from the south. All I have to say about this is, next year, within a year from now, the next round of invitees to BRICS is going to include Indonesia. South Korea's right-wing president Yoon Suk Yeol welcomes the deployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. They must mean they don't say nuclear, but tactical weapons. South Korea intends to arm his country with nuclear weapons, according to Chun. So we're really going to give them nuclear weapons to use against what? Who are they going to fire, the nuclear weapons at? Not China, because China is not going to directly attack Korea. Korea will be directly attacked, by North Korea. And they have not only tactical nuclear weapons, they have huge nuclear bombs with which they can obliterate South Korea and completely take over that country. The US, UK, and Australia, the AUKUS alliance announced in March that Australia would buy 3 nuclear-powered submarines by the early 2030s. Folks, we are talking about 2023 and 2024 now. If we push the Chinese, they will move up the planning of their unification with Taiwan. They're not going to wait around for 10 years. If we're threatening them with weapons, and if we're encircling them in the South China Sea, they will close on Taiwan in the next 2 or 3 years. Australia is not going to have any nuclear-powered submarines by that time. The Chinese mission to the UN condemned the deal, tweeting, quote, "The irony of AUKUS is that 2 nuclear weapon states who claim to uphold the highest nuclear but non-proliferation standard are transferring tons of weapons-grade enriched uranium to a non-nuclear weapon state, clearly violating the object and purpose of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which these countries, the US, the UK, and Australia, are signatories." In October 2022, the US announced it would deploy as many as 6 nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to northern Australia within striking range of China. I guess I have to mention the Russians have hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missiles within striking range of the United States. Do we really want to threaten China with nuclear bombing from B-52 bombers when those bombers might be shot out of the sky by hypersonic missiles? Does this make any sense? The U.S. promotes expansion of NATO into the Asia Pacific. The U.S. is promoting expansion of NATO in the Asia Pacific to close the military circle around China. Chun writes, how is NATO going to encircle China from Europe? The U.S. seeks to extend the influence of NATO to Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. This is a joke. There may be no NATO 1 year after the settlement of the war, in Ukraine. I mean, NATO might be kaput. What are they talking about? Chun identifies 3 significant aspects of the U.S. strategy. 1, stepped up remilitarization of Japan. Quote, revitalization of extremist hardline North Korea policies, unquote, in Washington and Seoul. And 3, escalation of highly belligerent war games targeted at China and North Korea. Wonderful. War game simulations, which we have never been victorious at yet. After World War II, the United States imposed a peace constitution, quote unquote, on Japan, but later pushed aggressively for Japanese rearmament to further the U.S. strategy to dominate the Asia Pacific. The United States considers the remilitarization of Japan, quote, the linchpin of U.S. security interests in Asia, unquote, Chun notes. The U.S. policy on North Korea is aimed at magnifying the purported North Korea threat and using it as a pretext to enlist South Korea and Japan in its scheme to contain China. Moreover, the joint military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea are dress rehearsals for an attack on and occupation of North Korea and the, quote, decapitation of its leadership, a, quote, plan for regime collapse and occupation, Chun writes. Next section says the South China Sea is a flashpoint. There are competing claims of sovereignty over bodies of land and their contiguous waters in the South China Sea. Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, also Malaysia and Brunei oppose China's historical claim to 90% of the South China Sea. This has led to tensions that have been exacerbated by the U.S. military maneuvers in the sea. So, South China Sea is one of the busiest maritime shipping routes, connecting it with China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, Singapore, the Strait of the Strait of uh, 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 um, um, the Malacca Straits and the Pacific coast of the United States. In 2016, more than 21% of global trade, totaling 3.37 trillion, transited through the South China Sea. In July of 2016, the Arbitral Tribunal in The Hague ruled for the Philippines in its case against China. The tribunal determined that China's territorial claims in the South China Sea and its actions toward the Philippines did not comply with international law. China refused to abide by the ruling. Quote, American warships regularly move around the restricted area of China's major islands under the range of Chinese guns, and at any time, due to some incident, military conflict between the two powerful superpowers could explode, unquote. Professor Dmitry Valentinovich, I guess, it's Mosyakov, wrote in the International Review of Contemporary Law of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, quote, U.S. military expeditions, which are supposed to demonstrate the U.S. commitment to the defense of freedom of navigation on the South China Sea, in fact, only reinforce and justify such activities of China's military preparation, unquote. And Mr. Moisyakov added that in July 2022, the United States decided that it was necessary to remind the People's Republic of China who was to determine the rules of navigation in the South China Sea, and other U.S. destroyers sailed into waters where China had declared a ban for military ships, unquote. Another provocation. The military does not belong in the South China Sea, and its provocative actions compound the danger of an already tense situation. Quote, the greatest threat to peace and stability in Northeast Asia is the U.S. Indo-Pacific Indo-Pacific military encirclement of China, unquote, Chun wrote. Likewise, Kuznick told Truth Out, quote, U.S. policymakers seem so terrified by China's extraordinary growth and challenge to the hegemony of the U.S. in the Pacific, they're willing to risk but nuclear annihilation to prevent it, unquote. On the final paragraph, we must need Daniel Ellsberg's admonition. Shortly before he died, he implored us to pursue, quote, the urgent goal of working with others to avert nuclear war in Ukraine or Taiwan or anywhere else, unquote. And Daniel Ellsberg, of course, was right about that. At various places, I've talked about the insanity of the foreign policy of the U.S. in the Asia-Pacific area. I have to here mention that China's territorial claims in the South China Sea are just excessive, and that if they were to withdraw from that kind of stance and to recognize the rights of other nations to part of the South China Sea and to settle the international claims, they would suddenly find that those other Southeast Asian nations would be much more open to joining the BRICS and joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I mean, that is absolutely plain to me. Uh, Certainly, the nations connected to the South China Sea, but generally speaking, see that China is an essential part of the future. All they want is their rights to navigation in the South China Sea to be recognized. Once that sore point, is removed from their relations with China, China will be much freer to pursue the Belt and Road Initiative, and also the BRICS will be much freer to include even more nations, all of which have a common interest in changing the international economic institutions so they are fair to all, and all of which have an interest in de-dollarizing international trade. So that's something that China should do. Okay, now, have you any comments on this, Dee?
You know, the U.S., as I see it, is just like it's like they're itching. They're itching for war. Everywhere we go, you know, especially with this mostly with Taiwan, to provoke China.
Okay, I guess I have to say, I don't think the U.S. is itching for war. I think the Biden administration, is itching for war or to provoke China. And the Trump administration would be likely to pursue the same foreign policy. But I don't think the people of the United States are itching for war with China or war with Russia. I think this is an opening for third parties because this is so irrational. I don't think the people of the United States want to risk any nuclear war with these other powers.
No, they don't. And it's like we're stuck with these neocons. How do we get rid of them? Both administration, they're in both administrations.
Well, we get
Like we
rid
say,
of
jump to
that.
corruption.
We get rid of them in part by trying to elect, a Robert Kennedy, inside of the Democratic primary, because he will undoubtedly pursue peace in both of these two theaters. And we also must support the candidacy of Cornel West, in the Green Party, because if Kennedy fails or is cheated out of the nomination, of the Democratic Party, it will be clear that both of the two parties are bent on war. And in that situation, the country should turn to a third-party candidate who does not want war, who will oppose war. And that is definitely Cornel West, the Green Party candidate. So that is what we can do about it. We, as voters, can do something about that. And if we do it within the framework of the dump the corruption idea, and we vote against the two major party candidates, not only for their corrupt foreign policy, but for their general corruption, for their monetary corruption, and the campaign corruption, and we replace in 2024 the whole House of Representatives, 1/3 of the Senate, and place someone who wants peace, in the presidency, then we can still change the situation. I know very few people can imagine that, but we must imagine that. And we must make that happen. We have no alternative. Our lives depend on it. I'm going to move to the third piece I wanted to cover tonight, because that has something to contribute as well. That's a piece I picked up, in LA Progressive. It's called China's Rise Hits a Wall. And it's written by Professor Mel Gertoff, who I believe is at Portland State University. I think he's Professor Emeritus there. And he says, China's economic and diplomatic successes are significant, but often have been exaggerated, while its weaknesses have been ignored, or underestimated. So this article is about trying to redress that balance by talking about the weaknesses of China. And I want to address what he thinks those particular weaknesses are, because I don't necessarily agree with him that China necessarily has those weaknesses. This was published on September 3rd, 2023, at least here, at LA Progressive. Where else it was published, I'm not clear, but we'll probably find out. Over the last decade or so, the tendency among China watchers has been to see China's rise as an endless upward progression, just as happened during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was viewed as a colossus that in fact had feet of clay. China's economic and diplomatic successes are significant, but often have been exaggerated, while its weaknesses have been ignored or underestimated. Only now, amidst bad news for China's economy, have observers awakened to certain Chinese realities. The first reality is that China's post-COVID economy is sputtering. It faces deflation, falling prices amidst stagnant domestic demand for goods, a collapsing real estate market, declining exports and imports, and very high government debts. Okay, here I have to immediately comment. Here we are talking about a government, China's government, that is a monetary sovereign in all but one criteria. It is a monetary sovereign in the sense that it issues its own currency. It is a monetary sovereign in the sense that it owes no debt in any other currency except its own. It is not a monetary sovereign because I believe it is still pegging its currency to the value of the dollar. However, it can end that peg overnight with an order by the Chinese government to allow, the renminbi to float. China can do that at any time and become a full monetary sovereign. Now, what can a full monetary sovereign do? One thing it can do is to stop issuing government debt so that the high government debt, is not, a problem. Another thing that it can do is to create demand for its goods, but domestically through cash grants to Chinese people. I know it normally extends loans at very favorable rates at this point, but it could do cash grants. It could run deficits as large as it wants to run deficits. It could stop the collapse of the real estate market by providing demand because it's a military sovereign. Mel Gurtov is not an MMT economist, so he doesn't understand this. Declining exports, and imports. China won't need to export as much if it provides its people with the currency needed to buy those goods that it's exporting. It will be able to import more if its people have the currency to import the goods, of other currencies. It would not face deflation if it's used its powers, as a monetary sovereign to run enormous deficits and not accompany those deficits with government debt issuance. The more serious debt problems of China are not the debt problems of its government. The debt problems of China are the debt problems of its private sector. But China can ease those with low interest loans and with cash grants. That's all it needs to do. For a regime that relies on domestic strength as the foundation of foreign policy success, this economic weakness has to be troubling. Xi Jinping has made internal security the hallmark of his administration, and if the economy isn't delivering growth with equity, political trouble may lie ahead. But as I've just indicated, it lies within the power of China to see to it that all the internal growth it wants can be gained as long as the factories of China are willing to produce the necessary goods, and as long as the service businesses of China are willing to offer the necessary services, in return for the yuan. That's all that has to happen. Many countries have proven that this kind of strategy is effective. If China adopts it, there will be no problem. And China is more than intelligent enough to adopt this. And if the economy isn't actually delivering growth with equity, political trouble may lie ahead, which explains efforts to reinforce Communist Party discipline in the military, double down repression in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet, and deal harshly with dissidents among lawyers and human rights activists. In short, there's considerable unrest and uncertainty, in the empire. That is nothing that high deficits aimed at empowering the Chinese consumer cannot cure. Certainly, China would not have to double down on repression in Xinjiang province. It wouldn't have to double down on repression in Hong Kong. Tibet, okay, is another matter, but that is not really so significant to China. So going on, the second reality is abroad. Chinese principal partners, Russia and North Korea, are liabilities as well as assets. Putin's war in Ukraine undermines Chinese diplomacy in Europe and adds to China's America problems, while North Korea's nuclear and missile threats bring a dangerous instability to the Korean Peninsula. Well, there's only instability there if the United States creates instability by its continual challenges to China. And also, that instability may be in China's favor and not, in the US's favor. As to whether Putin's war in Ukraine undermining Chinese diplomacy in Europe, as I said before, that war on Ukraine is likely to be done by the end of the year. And when it is, you will see a flock, of European nations once again calling on Russia to supply natural gas and oil and grain, to Europe. I don't see this so-called second reality as significant at all. Inside Central Asia, China is competing with and actually outcompeting Russia in relations with the former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Well, that may be true, but I don't see Russia being upset by that. Russia has, in fact, during the Ukraine war, been increasing its trade with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. All of the Central Asian countries have been happy to get Russian goods during the Ukraine war, and they will want to trade for the resources of Russia following that war. In South and Southeast Asia, China inspires both fear and awe. Most countries accept the need to accommodate China, which is their dominant trading partner, which means, of course, that they might be quite willing to join BRICS and quite willing to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But while China has predominant political influence in Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, that's Burma, other governments, including India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Taiwan, look to the U.S. as a balancing power against China. Polling of citizens and elites in Southeast Asia points to more positive feelings toward the U.S. than toward China. Well, right now, and given the U.S. propaganda in those countries, that is certainly true. But through BRICS and through the Belt and Road Initiative, that polling is due for a change over the coming 10 years. Before the Ukraine war, even the closest U.S. allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, were willing to accommodate China. Japan, by refusing to commit to defending Taiwan in case of war, and by restraining its military capabilities. South Korea, by forging a close trade relationship and not fully embracing THAAD, that's THAAD, a missile defense system aimed at both North Korea and China. By the way, There's good reason not to fully embrace THAAD because that missile defense system won't be able to defend against the hypersonic missiles that North Korea and China will have or can get from Russia. But now, all three have recommitted to tight security ties with the United States and with each other. Japan and South Korea concluded their first summit in 12 years in March. And this weekend at Camp David, they joined the first summit hosted by U.S. President, where the three countries agreed to respond as one to regional threats, meaning, of course, from North Korea and China. Now, they're talking threats, but will Japan actually attack China? If China moves on Taiwan and tries to reunify with Taiwan in the short run, in other words, something happens over the next 2 or 3 years, and China says to itself, we've had enough of this. We have more than the necessary military power to take Taiwan back, right now. Then what happens? Or, even more seriously, what happens if the Kuomintang Party wins the election of 2024 in Taiwan, and they negotiate a reunification schedule with China, say by 2035 or something like that? And what if the Kuomintang concludes a defense agreement with China and invites China to establish a military base on Taiwan? What happens then? What grounds will we have to start a war with China over that, when the ruling party in Taiwan has decided to make those kinds of arrangements? Will Japan go to war with China over that? Will South Korea go to war with North Korea and China over that? I don't think so. Korea and Japan are also exposing export controls on high-end computer chips normally sent to China. Japan has also embarked on a military buildup aimed directly at China. Australia and India have followed suit, becoming part of the Quad security dialogue and the AUKUS group. Well, this is also is all true, but all of this revolves around China attack on Taiwan. If that attack happens very quickly before all these other forces can get organized, or if that attack is not necessary because the Kuomintang actually makes agreements with China, then what will this defensive group actually do? China is unlikely to take any other military action in that area because it's going to concentrate on the Belt and Road Initiative. It's going to concentrate on trade. It's not going to threaten South Korea. It's not going to threaten Japan. I mean, that's not going to happen. Or maybe I should say, well, what if that does happen? Then what will happen to these alliances encircling China that U.S. foreign policy is busily constructing? The next section is money doesn't always talk. China's chief calling card is money, specifically its Belt and Road Initiative loan program that has spent hundreds of billions of dollars globally, mainly to developing countries. Most Asia Pacific countries have joined the BRI. Some analysts think the BRI is a very successful effort to meet developing countries' needs without imposing onerous conditions, in contrast with loans from the World Bank and the IMF. Others see BRI as a debt trap that creates dependence on China, leading to sacrifices of sovereignty, such as control of ports. Serious studies of the BRE show that it is neither all one nor but all the other, and I compliment the author Mel Gurtoff for saying that. That's what serious studies do say. But one thing is clear: the BRI has become a Chinese debt burden, and given China's economic woes, chances are good Beijing will not be nearly as generous as in the past. And to that, I have to add, if Chinese embraces its monetary sovereignty and doesn't accompany its deficits by issuing debt, then there will be no debt burden for China. No debt burden at all. Debt burdens for monetary sovereigns are optional. They can get rid of those as rapidly as they would like to get over those. Gurtoff doesn't understand that because he doesn't understand what monetary sovereign nations can do. He needs to read some MMT. Some Chinese actions are undermining the BRI's appeal. Take the Southeast Asian neighbors that rely on the Mekong River for fishing. Chinese dams are taking a large bite out of their fishing industry, arousing anger. Mongolia, long economically dependent on China, is now reaching out to the U.S. for trade and just struck a major deal with Google for computer assistance. Well, I don't know what to say about these two things. Okay, I have to say again, I think these two examples, okay, are incidents on the cow's butt, as I indicated earlier. Competing territorial claims in the South China Sea have put China at odds with Vietnam and the Philippines. I already said that if China settles that, it's going to increase its capability to extend BRICS and extend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Put China at odds with Vietnam and the Philippines. Vietnam and the U.S. have just agreed to a strategic partnership, and President Biden will visit Vietnam on September 9th. The Philippines, which under Rodrigo Duterte had accommodated China, now under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has reverted to a strategic partnership with the U.S. in response to Chinese pressure in the South China Sea. So again, I say, if China withdraws that pressure, that's going to settle that. More recently, a heavily armed Chinese Coast Guard vessel tried to block a Philippine supply boat from reaching a beach shift that marks its claimed territory in Mischief Reef. I think that's a no-no for China. They have to stop doing that kind of thing and act in a friendly manner to their neighbors. Philippines is opening 4 additional military bases to the U.S. and is restarting joint naval patrols with the U.S., but it has rejected a Chinese invitation to conduct joint patrols, a strange request considering that China still uses its 9-dash line to claim a vast swatch of the South China Sea. As I said before, China has to stop doing that. It is an obstacle to its overall success in the pursuit of its foreign policy of collaboration with other nations and mutual development with other nations. In sum, if you're looking at the world through the eyes of Chinese leaders, you see obstacles on the home front that demand attention and resources at the very time a new Cold War looms over Asia, with the U.S. massing its allies to contain the presumed Chinese threat. what Xi Jinping has found, just as Chairman Mao did, is that domestic weaknesses constrain Chinese actions abroad. Oh, by the way, I have to say, there's no comparison between Chairman Mao and Xi Jinping because China is now a monetary sovereign and a largely developed nation that can goose up its consumer sector to end its economic problems at this point. China's leaders will always give priority to security at home over priorities abroad. Xi Jinping's concept of comprehensive security, quote unquote, makes that plain. That perspective should inform the analysis of China hawks, in Washington. I also have to say that the MMT perspective should inform the analysis of China doves in Washington as well, because China has to do very little to solve the various problems that are raised, in this article for the further advance of the multipolar world. A multipolar world, by the way, whose major powers would include the BRICS nations, Russia and China, and some other nations that are not yet part of the BRICS, including the nation, of Indonesia, which should be very ripe for BRICS entry and for the Belt and Road Initiative. Indonesia is potentially a very major power, has a huge population, I believe the sixth, the largest population in the world right now. It's a larger population than, for example, Brazil. So it stands to become a major nation, in the future. What it needs is the financial support that can be delivered by the new development bank, and it needs various deals to be done. And the various nations of BRICS are in place to do those deals. So I think the future is bright for multipolarity, and it's bright, for BRICS. What China has to mainly do is avoid, a nuclear war with the United States. And I think for the Chinese, the avoidance of that nuclear war depends on the continuing buildup of the strength, of China. And it also depends on any deal which the Chinese can do with the Kuomintang when it takes over Taiwan, which I'm fairly sure will happen in 2024. So, Dee, I know this was a really long one, unfortunately, but at this point, have you any comments?
I was going to say it's important to go over all of this because of the fact that people aren't getting the correct information. They don't understand the one China policy. They don't really understand what is going on over there. So it's very
Yes, I agree. And I think they don't understand. One critical thing they don't understand is they don't understand the strength of the Russia-China combination that we're looking at right now. I don't think they understand the strength of the development of the armed forces, of China, over the years. They haven't concentrated on offense. They haven't concentrated on the ability to attack the mainland of the United States. What they've concentrated on, is defense, on blocking the ability of any foreign power to stop the Chinese from being able to reunify with Taiwan, and also to block any foreign power from making a naval power on China through a move that go up the main rivers of China. In Chinese history, that was very important. That's the way the West subjugated China, okay, in the first place. And China has organized its defensive forces to make that completely impossible. The West will not be able to dislodge the regime in China, okay, no matter what, okay, it does. And I don't even think, uh, okay, I don't even think that the Europeans are going to want to do that. Okay, I don't see why they would want to engage in that as opposed to engaging with trade in China. Why would they care whether the Chinese economy, okay, is doing well as long as they're sharing in the prosperity?
Mhm.
Why should they join the United States in
Europe is
opposing?
collapsing as we've seen it. They've got to try to regroup themselves.
Yeah,
A scary place.
yeah, it's scary times for them. And the Chinese Russian combination have the power to take away those scary times just by replacing the oil and gas. That's all they have to do. And they have the capability to do that. Okay, if they're in alliance with the Iranians, okay, and with Saudi and with the UAR, uh, I mean, they've got the oil all covered and they can supply it to Europe at low prices. And the US isn't capable of doing that. So it doesn't make economic sense for the Europeans to join a crusade against China.
It's totally ridiculous.
Yep.
It's like suicidal for them. They're so weak.
Yeah. So I think the key to make all this apparent is for Russia to quickly wind up the Ukraine business and then make it absolutely clear through their subsequent actions that they are no military threat, okay, to Europe. Okay, if they do that, and if the Chinese make further overtures to Europe, through the Belt and Road Initiative, and the rump state, okay, of Ukraine, which will by then be within the Russian sphere, uh, the grain and the oil will start to flow again, okay, to Europe, and the other raw materials will start to flow to Europe, so their industries in Europe can be fed, so that the living standards of Europe, can be restored. Uh, it, it's going to be all over. The multipolar world is going to be a reality, and Europe is going to end up being one of the poles. And why would it not want to do that?
Yeah.
Okay, it is simply beyond me. We don't have a lot of comments here tonight, which is probably, well, it says there were only two comments. Obviously, there are more than two comments
There's a lot of comments there.
that I see, so I don't know what that was about. But Robert Copeland, even if Russia wins the war with Ukraine, they will still be a weakened nation. No, I don't. Okay, I don't agree with that, Robert. I think their economy has been goosed by the war. It's basically been a case of military Keynesianism for them. Okay, it's like our economy has been goosed by our wars. If North and South Korea started a nuclear war against each other, then both countries would be destroyed. I agree, it doesn't make any sense for them. And Steve Gostart says our nuclear weapons will be safe and effective. What? Well, he says our nuclear weapons. Oh, I see. He's being sarcastic. He says our nuclear weapons, spelling it NEW space CLEAR, and then he leaves a grin for us all. Very cute, Steve Ghostar. Robert Copeland says nobody wins in a nuclear war as both sides will most likely be destroyed. A lot of people are saying that you must support President Biden because they say Donald Trump will win if you vote for Cornel West. I know what they're saying, but what I'm saying is uh, both the Republicans, okay, and the Democrats, as voters, Republican voters, okay, and Democrat voters, need to abandon their parties because both of their parties have a crazy foreign policy that will destroy us all. Foreign policy needs to be the main issue. Okay, the Democrats have a chance of keeping themselves in office if they get rid of Biden, okay, and they go to Bobby Kennedy. But if they don't, the only alternative for people to vote for is going to be Cornel West.
And a vote for Cornel West is a vote for Cornel West. It doesn't mean that you were going to vote for one of the other candidates. You weren't going to vote for anybody for president if you don't vote for Cornel West. That's
Well,
how some people feel.
uh,
I'm voting for Cornel West, and the fact is, I'm not taking a vote away from anybody because I wasn't going to vote for anybody else.
okay, so I think that's a valid argument. I entirely agree with it. But okay, the point is uh, that the stakes are very, very high here when it comes to voting against both Biden and Trump if they turn out, okay, to be the candidates. Because not only will you be voting to maintain the corruption that has ruined our political system, but you will be voting for the risk of nuclear war. And you will be voting for the failure of the human race to meet the climate emergency and to continue to exist. If you vote for either Trump, okay, or Biden, you're risking your very, okay, existence. That is much more important, okay, than the consideration that if you vote for Cornel West, you're voting for Trump. The point is, both Biden and Trump are unacceptable. And if Bobby Kennedy is not, okay, the nominee of the Democratic Party, the only acceptable choice from any of the parties that we have seen thus far will be Cornel West. I'm not going to say that I will vote for Cornel West right now. I don't know whether I will, okay, or not. It all depends on how things work out, okay, in the primaries. It all depends on what Cornel West does to finance his campaign. It all depends on who he becomes associated with in terms of campaign people who are likely to come into his administration. There are a number of different but choices. It depends on what other third parties come up with. But right now, Cornel West is the most attractive of the third party candidates. And right now, it looks like the two major parties will field candidates who are unacceptable because they will be in favor of risking, okay, nuclear war.
One, a neoliberal, a neocon.
Yes. They both are neoliberals, and Trump's foreign policy people in his first administration were neocons. They were Republican neocons rather than Democratic neocons, but there are neocons in both parties. Trump's foreign policy people were neocons, and it was they who started the anti-China policy. Gostat says this morning the Attorney General's office filed RICO indictments for 60 people alleged to be part of the Stop Cop City movement. RICO indictments against the people wanting to stop Cop City. Incredible. Gostat says U.S. foreign policy is U.S. domestic policy. I'm afraid it is. And Mark Collins says BRICS gives the EU nations, a way out, of the EU. I think, Mark, that's a very pregnant sort of comment. I entirely agree. BRICS gives the EU nations, a way out, of the EU. It certainly does. And that's well put. Go start. The Iranian Ministry of Oil and Gas, based on the agreement signed a while ago, Iran will build a refinery in Burkina Faso. Africa needs infrastructure and not lectures from dying empires. You got it, Go Start. You got it. And Mark Collins says DNC equals World War III, RNC equals Second Civil War, but also World War III. Green equals social justice. Transcend Duverger's gaslight. But after all, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is. Lana says, I've been listening in the background. I refuse to say who I am voting for right now. Well, I haven't made up my mind either, Lana. I may decide to keep it to myself when the time comes. Sick of vote shaming. I couldn't agree with you more, Lana. On all those points, Ghostot says, I don't remember this much flooding ever. Turkey, Spain, Greece, etc. Obviously, it's global warming. Two of the biggest Chinese real estate developers that are in big trouble are Evergrande and Country Garden, as both companies have a huge debt. Yeah, that's true, but of course, whether the Chinese government wants them to fail, or not, is important because the Chinese government can either get them out, of the bad debts, save them from failure, or can allow them to fail. That's solely within the control of the Chinese government. So, I'm sure we'll be seeing the power of China as a monetary sovereign. I'm sure we'll be seeing it exerted more and more, in the future. And Mark Hahn says, I've been posting this on Dr. West's pages and support pages. Please make your own or duplicate this one. Does Cornel West understand MMT macroeconomic principles? Will he advocate for the most sustainable order of operations to mitigate inflation with those principles in mind? I have messaged I sent a message to Ajamu Baraka to put a bug, in his ear. We can put a bug also into the ear, of Madeline Hoffman about this. We are in a very good position to this.
Yes, we are.
Greatly increase Cornel West's chances to win if he embraced the macroeconomic principles, okay, of MMT. I know he knows who Stephanie Kelton is. I know he can call her up at any time or get someone to have her call him. They can schedule meetings. He can be educated, okay, in MMT, if he doesn't but yet know it. I'm sure she will be happy to accommodate him. I don't know whether she will be prepared to support his candidacy in some formal way. I don't know whether she's ready to do that yet, but I'm sure she and many other people uh, who know the MMT would be happy to educate him, okay, in the principles, okay, of MMT, and will be happy to educate him about the order of operations to mitigate inflation, in the words of Mark W. Collins. So, I think this has been a very interesting night, and I thank you all for coming. Are you ready to say goodnight, Dee, or do you want to say something more?
I'm ready to say goodnight. I'm glad, you spoke about the issues you spoke about because these are important topics right now.
And Mark says the order of spending operations to mitigate inflation is important. I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. Okay, it's important. Okay, and the next president needs to be well aware, okay, of that. He needs to appoint people to the National Economics Council and to the Council, okay, of Economic Advisors, and as Secretary of Treasury, and to the Federal Reserve that will support the policies that use the correct order of spending operations in expanding and creating our own domestic prosperity. That is so important. The only economists who have a good handle, okay, on inflation right now are the MMT, okay, economists. They're the ones who have expended far more effort and energy on the inflation problems than any other school, okay, of economics. They need to be listened to. They need to be in positions of power in the new administration in 2025. They need to be in positions of power in the critical campaigns that may get us out of the fix that we're in when it comes to foreign policy. That means they need to be critical in Bobby Kennedy's campaigns. They need to be critical in Cornel West's campaigns as well, because both candidates provide hope that we can get out of the mess, okay, that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
So on that note, I'm going to leave you all. I'll be back but tomorrow night with one of my Dump the Corruption shows. I'll probably be talking about some issues and some activities, okay, at least but some in the healthcare area, okay, and another area that make clear the importance of dumping the corruption by following the voting rule that I show very often in the Dump the Corruption shows. In fact, let me see. The DTC show tomorrow will be very much focused on the Medicare Advantage uh, uh, situation and how it defrauds the public. So that gives you a little preview, okay, of that. Okay, and on that note, okay,
If you could please hit the like button, subscribe, and share.
yes, and please buy us coffees.
Yeah,
Okay,
$5.
my buy me a
buy me
coffee is flashing across the screen on the bottom. My Patreon account is also there. Okay, D, what is your buy me a coffee account?
After buymeacoffee.com, the slam bar, it's just D Pierce.
Okay, so there you
Okay.
have it. And hopefully we'll be seeing you all tomorrow night.
Yes, thank you. And good night, everybody. And good night, Bonnie.
Good night.
Good night, D. Okay,
Bye.
I'll see you at 8 o'clock tomorrow. I say that because D's show is at 8 o'clock and mine is at 9.